Thank you. And great that we're getting such a crowd. I think we all wondered how many people would be interested in biodiversity in this crowd. It's really interesting topic because we have just had two major UN conferences. The conference in Montreal was on biodiversity, and it has created a global framework. So this is a very, very good topic to dive into now. What can business do about biodiversity? But the first thing I want to say, first of all, I'm CEO of Planet Tracker, just to introduce myself. And we have Mel Pellison, who's the Advocacy Director for Business for Nature, Evil Mulder, who's the Head of Climate Finance at UNEP, Edward Perry, who's Biodiversity Policy Analyst at OECD, and Fiona Ball has a very interesting title. She's Group Director of Bigger Picture and Sustainability at Sky Group. So anyway, welcome to the panel. Before we launch into the discussion, I just want to ask everybody if they even know what biodiversity means. It's a term that a lot of people use, but I would say that many people don't really understand. And so one of the things we want to also discuss is in today's world for business, when we're talking about biodiversity, what are we talking about? And one of the things that has morphed out of the term biodiversity is natural capital, or nature, or ecosystem services. And when we talk about biodiversity and dependencies, we're talking about dependency on nature. And the World Economic Forum came out with a report that said 50% of the world's GDP is highly dependent on nature. But think about it. Isn't 100% of the world's GDP dependent on nature, if you think about it? I mean, what company doesn't depend on something that comes from nature? We're nature, aren't we? We need water and we need food. So it's a topic that we have to dive into. And one of the things that I hear much in my journey is I'm just getting my head around net zero. How do I get my head around biodiversity? What is that? What do I measure? So one of the things we need to talk about is, as a business person, how do you start thinking about measuring biodiversity? So to frame it, Mel, would you give us a kind of overview of what's happening?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Sure. So I think Business for Nature, we're a global coalition, and we were created 4 years ago. And our objective was really to put the biodiversity on the agenda of businesses. And in the last 4 years, we've seen how much growing interest, and the full room today probably shows that. There's much more interest because businesses realize that they rely on nature. So the momentum is really growing. Every year the World Economic Forum publishes its risk report. Environmental risks are always on the top 5, with biodiversity loss being also on the top 5. So there's a very growing understanding that biodiversity is a material risk, and the crisis we are facing is a material risk for business. When also we started 4 years ago, the narrative was a bit around, for future generations, we will need to do that. I don't hear that anymore because it's actually for our current generation, and businesses are starting to realize the impacts of nature loss and climate now. I mean, last year, the wildfires are having massive impacts on tourism, the droughts are having massive impacts on agriculture today. So it's not even for the next generation, it's actually for today. So this growing understanding and interest is really there. But it's also opportunities, right? And that's what also grabbed people's interest. And it's a question of survival for business. So we also hear the question, but you have so much to deal with. There's so many urgencies and so many things. Why would we care about nature? We're doing so much about climate, but there's no choice. So we're here to work on this together. And actually, we're at a very interesting point now, because also a lot of the question we were getting from businesses was, but what is it we need to do? What is this global goal? What is the equivalent to the 1.5 degrees for climate? What are we trying to do? So in December, Robin mentioned there was the COP15, so the biodiversity COP, the sister to the climate COP that everyone is very familiar with, that met in Montreal after 2 years of delay, and finally adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's a framework for the next 10 years, or 8 years actually, because it was delayed, on what is the world supposed to do to address this crisis. And it's quite comprehensive. It is quite ambitious. It could have been more ambitious, but given the situation, we are actually very happy with the results. And it sets the plan for everyone, for all of society, so for government, but also for non-state actors like businesses, on what is it that we need to do collectively to address this crisis. So there is 4 goals, a mission, 23 targets, a lot of very comprehensive, and it's really the government putting on paper what needs to happen, and it really gives the direction to businesses on where action is needed. So out of the 4 goals and 23 targets, most of them are very relevant for businesses, but I just wanted to highlight 3 key elements of the framework. The first one is the mission, so the 2030 mission, which is a global goal for all of society of where we need to be in 2030. And this is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. So now we are losing nature. We need that by 2030, we reach back to the point where we were in 2020. This is our global goal. This is the equivalent to the 1.5 degrees for climate. And this is where all businesses need to address, transform their strategies to align with this global goal. So that gives a very clear direction of where we need to be. The other one is the target 15 that you might have heard of, which is the target that define the role of business and financial institutions. It's actually a very strong signal, and it's a very strong message giving to businesses that governments will start requiring all large business and financial institutions to assess and disclose their impact and dependencies and risks on biodiversity along operation and value chains. So very strong signal that by 2030, this will be made a requirement all around the world. So a very strong signal for businesses to start preparing and implementing those regulations. And the last target is the target 18 on the reform of environmentally harmful subsidies, which is obviously very important. If we could continue financing harmful activities, then how can we achieve the mission that I was talking about? So this is also a very strong signal for businesses, and that needs to get ready because this transformation is coming. So we really recommend that businesses start looking internally what type of subsidies are you receiving? Because we ran a consultation a few months ago and we asked businesses, are you receiving harmful subsidies? And 95% responded, no, or I don't know. When you know that trillions of US dollars are going every year to subsidies, for sure all businesses are receiving harmful subsidies, but they don't realize that they don't know because it's hidden, it's taxes and all of this. So we need to start identifying and start preparing for this transition because it's coming, and I think Eddie will probably talk more about it. But so this was the great news of December. Now what does that mean for businesses? It means businesses need to start acting, and the question we get from businesses when they come to us is like, okay, I understand this is a problem, but the landscape is so complicated, there's so much happening, what do I need to do, who do I need to talk, I'm really confused. So together with a lot of organizations, we try to simplify a little bit a journey, where to start and where to go, and we created what we call this Act D framework. It's not really a framework, it's more like showing the different steps. And it has 4 different high-level actions that businesses need to take. The first one is to assess. You need to understand where your impacts and dependencies are, your material impacts, and you need to understand them so that you can then take action and transform in the way you need to. So for that, there's a lot of guidance, a lot of framework that are available, like the Capitals Protocol, like the LEAP framework of the TNFD, the SBTN guidance. So there's a lot that is already available for business to start doing that today. Then the second one is to commit. So that means having publicly available, meaningful commitments and targets. You might have heard of the Science-Based Target Network, which is currently putting a lot of efforts in developing very detailed and long guidance to businesses on how to set those science-based targets. But there's already some guidance available to start preparing. The third one, probably the most important step, is to transform. So that means, first of all, to avoid and reduce negative impact. That must be the first step. But also to increase positive impact by investing in regeneration and in restoration. But then also transforming completely business models, because that needs a systematic transformation. So it's not enough to just say, I'm not going to invest here. You really need to collectively transform the way we are seeing the economy and the way we run a business. And the last point, which is close to my heart, because I'm the advocacy director at Business for Nature, is to advocate. So really our theory of change in Business for Nature is that we need business action, and we need to demonstrate to governments that businesses are ready to act, that they are already taking action, but it's not enough, and we need stronger policies to amplify, to accelerate this transformation. And once we have stronger policies, then more businesses will start acting, and it's also a way of leveling the playing field. And finally, the last point is to disclose, which is making all of this transparently. So the assessment needs to be disclosed publicly, the commitments needs to be public, so we also create some terms of accountability. So good luck. There's a very clear path, and, and I'm sure you have no question.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Now, Eva, having listened to all of this, we know that there is a time urgency. Yes, I mean, 2030 is just around the corner, and we still are talking about 2035 and 2050. How are we going to enable business to transition rapidly? What are the enablers? For example, we hear about biodiversity credits, for example. What sort of mechanisms are you seeing evolve right now?
Yeah, happy to answer the question. Maybe before, just building on Mel's point, may I see a show of hands who's heard about the term net zero? And then another show of hands who knows the term nature positive.
Yeah.
It's quite a lot actually.
Wow.
So really well done.
Great.
So I think we're partly speaking to the converted. But what I mean to Mal's point, like we live in a very complex society, and it's the easiest way to dissect that is to isolate issues. Like let's deal with climate, let's deal with energy, let's deal with social issues. My suggestion to those businesses who are in the room here today is to look at both your net zero, your race to net zero, as well as the race to become nature positive, to the point of Mal about turning the dial, and whether that is using the Science-Based Targets Network or anything else. I think those frameworks are coming, and so understanding what your footprint is, how do you commit, and how do you reduce that would make sense, as opposed to waiting a few years. Also because these issues are interlinked. To your point, Robin, I mean, what can business do? You've obviously heard about carbon markets. There's been a resurgence in carbon markets. At the same time, some criticism as well, especially project-based carbon, from the potential of inflated baseline. So assessing the potential of carbon emissions against another baseline that may amend or reduce the amount of emissions that you can generate and sell. There's obviously the equivalent for biodiversity that's now being discussed as well. There's a biodiversity credit alliance. There's different businesses thinking like, how should this be done? My suggestion to those in the room is when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, the most important is first is deep and immediate emission cuts, and then using offsets and compensation as an add-on. And the same would be true for biodiversity. It's seeing like how are you dependent and impacting on nature directly as a business, and also through your suppliers and from whom you're sourcing. And then thinking of like how do you reduce that residual biodiversity impact that you may have? How do you inform your customers about that? How do you inform your clients about that? So I think carbon and biodiversity credits is something that I don't think will go away, but there will be a lot of scrutiny about the criteria both on the supply side as well as on the demand side. Second is the agriculture, the food and agriculture sector. We just had lunch. About 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions and about 3/4 of nature impact come from the food that we eat. And so we do need changes in the global food system. At the moment, it is a race to the bottom where margins are being scraped and farmers are being squeezed until there's nothing to squeeze anymore. We need different kinds of models that are, say, shorter supply chains where there are premiums being paid, where people are better connected to those who are actually producing the food in the first place, which might actually mean that some of the big companies today might not exist 15 or 20 years from now, because there's a big push for, say, alternative protein and all kinds of others. So my suggestion for those food companies in the room, if you're not willing to change or only incrementally, there may be some reckoning also in the years to come. The third mechanism that I'd like to highlight is around sovereign debt. So there have been a lot of movement around green bonds, both by governments and businesses as well, using that specifically for onshore, offshore wind or solar. There's now also experimentation with nature-linked sovereign bonds. Uruguay issued a climate bond that was also linked to its forest potential, or the level of forest cover in the country. And there are other countries like Pakistan, Chile, and others who are thinking about that as well. So using essentially the bond market to raise money to invest in conservation, restoration, and other means. The last point, which we came up with during dinner yesterday with a number of chief sustainability officers, is that the business and financial models on which you're basing your decisions, the net present value of investment decisions, may also be up for revision. There were quite a few companies that basically said we need to also quantify the cost of inaction. We need to quantify the cost of market changes and changes in perception, because if we don't do that, we might actually be facing unintended consequences before a project is actually reaching conclusion. So those are some mechanisms. So the credits, the premiums, changes in the agri-food supply chain, nature-linked sovereign debt, and the I would say revision of net present value and the cost of inaction as a way of informing your decisions going forward.
Great, thank you. That sets the framework for the various instruments. Now, Edward, can you talk to us about the role of government and what you feel, I mean, are governments really stepping up and doing the framing that they need to do to direct the change?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Robin, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me first just start by saying, you're absolutely right. Biodiversity underpins all of the economy, all businesses. And with 1 million species now threatened with extinction, many ecosystems approaching tipping points, we need nothing short of rapid and transformative change to production and consumption practices. And our governments have a really key role to play in driving those transformative changes by providing clear policy signals. So this comes back to your point earlier, Mai. We need clear policy signals from the government. We have a strong foundation in place now with the Global Biodiversity Framework. Governments must now work swiftly to translate those into national targets, ambitious national targets, and economy-wide policies. One of the challenges with biodiversity is that the various ecosystem services it underpins, water filtration, pollination, water regulation, these services are not priced in our market. They're essentially free of charge. And as a result, we overexploit our biodiversity. Governments can address this market failure through the use of economic instruments. So I'm talking about things like taxes on fertilizers and pesticides, payments for ecosystem services, biodiversity offsets, and tradable permit schemes for fisheries, for example. So it's very much like a cap and trade, emissions trading scheme for carbon, but the cap's on fish catch. Now, through these economic instruments, governments can incentivize innovation from businesses to find low-cost solutions. And at the OECD, we advocate for these approaches because they have the potential to be cost-effective, economically efficient, and in some cases also generate revenue for governments. We collect data from across 120 countries on these economic instruments. And just to give you an example, biodiversity-relevant taxes, the revenue we get from biodiversity-relevant taxes is less than 1% of the revenue we get from all environmentally relevant taxes, which in turn is just 5% of the revenue we get from other taxes, right? Now, if we scale these up, we can provide fiscal flexibility so governments can shift the tax burden from things like labor. And at the same time, we reduce the negative impacts on biodiversity and therefore reduce the need for biodiversity financing. Now, you've already alluded to it. The second key area that I want to touch on is environmentally harmful subsidies. Yeah. Now, these are pervasive. OECD data shows that about half, actually more than half of government support to agriculture is what we consider potentially most environmentally harmful. So it's 390 billion per year. The rest of global support for agriculture does very little to actually advance sustainability. OECD IEA estimates on fossil fuel support put these at 732 billion in 2021. And just recently, IEA released a report showing that fossil fuel support for consumers alone skyrocketed to 1 trillion last year in 2022. Well, you said businesses need to do their homework, essentially, to identify what harmful subsidies they're receiving from governments. Well, turn back and say, yes, but governments need to do their homework too. We found that actually very few governments have taken the very first step, which is to identify and assess potentially harmful incentives at the domestic level. So we, late last year, released a report to guide countries in that process. So obviously we need to reform these harmful subsidies, and we can use this instrument to promote biodiversity. So targeted payments for sustainability in sectors such as agriculture and fisheries can deliver triple win outcomes for biodiversity, the economy, and livelihoods. So perhaps just to summarize there, if we're going to have the transformative change we need, governments need to first align the economic incentives, right? And so I would call on businesses here to demand from governments clear policies, strong policies, to level the playing field. And these policies should be supporting business leaders that are driving sustainability, not hindering your efforts. But I'd also encourage you to continue to push the envelope, continue to integrate biodiversity across all areas of business, whether it's strategy and governance, risk assessment, reporting, due diligence, disclosure. Continue to drive change within your supply chains and across your industries more generally. And I just want to pick up an important point. I think, Eva, you said, we can't deal with climate and biodiversity in a sequential manner. We need to be looking at these together. They're closely interlinked. There are a lot of synergies, but there are also potential trade-offs. And we actually don't have time to muck around on either of these challenges. So we need to go ahead in an integrated manner.
Okay.
I'll wrap it up there, thanks.
Thank you, Edward. Fiona, you're our representative
I'm the
from
only
business.
to answer the question.
How quickly can business actually change is one of my questions. And we'd love to hear about what's happening at Sky, but also we need to address the mechanisms that we've heard about, but how quickly can this happen?
So I think the point that two panel members have mentioned today around the fact that biodiversity and nature and climate are intrinsically linked is the key, to be perfectly honest in this. Nobody can reach net zero without looking at biodiversity and nature and how we conserve and restore a very important carbon sink, a natural carbon sink, in order to get to net zero. We know that we're going to have to reduce rapidly in the next, kind of 8 years till 2030, 50% kind of absolute reductions in our carbon footprint as part of net zero. But there's going to be this 5-10% that's going to be really tricky for any business to actually reduce. We can look at kind of technology that's coming our way in terms of carbon capture and storage, but biodiversity and nature is going to be a significant part of this. Now, a recent report showed that nature currently absorbs, 2 gigatons of carbon per annum. We need to get to 8. And that's a significant amount. And to do that, we need to double the amount of nature absorption we have as part of any net zero kind of strategy. So I would say business has 3 key areas that it needs to focus on. First of all, it needs to understand what its impact in biodiversity and nature is in terms of its net zero strategy. Now, when we have a look, so for Sky, for example, our biggest impact across our net zero is our value chain emissions. And we work that out through something called a life cycle assessment of all of our products and services that we bring to the market. Now, as part of that, it's not only carbon that we should be measuring, but it's also the biodiversity and nature impacts within our supply chain, because we have significant impacts, and every single business has an impact on biodiversity and nature. Now, for example, when we did that for Sky, we produce electronic products. So you watch TV because there's a set-top box, the Sky Glass, which is the TV now, we have broadband routed. We have a significant kind of manufacturing supply chain. One of the big material things that we found that our impact on biodiversity and nature was the use of single-use plastics in the packaging of our products. And so 2 years ago, we made a commitment to be single-use plastic-free in all of our products and services that we put in our packaging. And we've done that. And that's really, really important because single-use plastic is still ending up in our oceans and still affecting a significant part of the ocean health, which is a big carbon sink and one that we mustn't forget about. Secondly, it's having a look at, okay, as part of your net zero carbon strategy, how are you going to absorb the remaining 5 or 10% that is really going to be very, very tricky in order to reduce? And the answer there is we've made a commitment to do that through biodiversity, nature, and conservation. We would love to be able to restore our biodiversity and nature as part of this. But in order to do that, we need to start investing now. These carbon sinks take a long time to regenerate in order to absorb this. If you're looking at UK woodland and restoration, because we would love to be able to do something in the UK and Europe, we've lost a huge amount of our forests. That will take 50 years to start absorbing the amount of carbon we're looking at. If you're looking at seagrass, we've only got about 10% of seagrass around our shores. That's something that'd be fast, but we need to start working on this now, and salt marshes and lots of different things. So that's what I think that also businesses should do. Also, it's things like, we're part of Business for Nature as well, is stand up as a large business and advocate for these things. Talk to your suppliers, talk to other businesses. Be a leader in your sector and ask the questions around what others are doing around biodiversity and nature. And we do need more policy. We've got a really clear legal framework and legal requirement to be net zero carbon by 2050 in the UK. There's not that same requirement on biodiversity and nature, and understanding how businesses can invest in the right way in our UK and our European nature. We should have an overarching framework and an idea of how businesses can do the right thing and invest. And then finally, I'll bring up the issue of offsetting and carbon credits. So, and there's a lot of issue around this, and transparency is keen about anything to do with kind of investment or carbon offsetting. Now, this should not be done separately from your commitment around net zero. Net zero and the SBTi targets are very, very clear. We have to reduce by 50% our carbon impact of 2030 in absolute terms. That does not include offsetting. But I'm an advocate that you have to do absolutely everything that you can do right now. We can't wait until 2050 to start investing in nature. And one of the ways that businesses can invest, unless you buy lots of land yourself, is to do that through good project managers who are very transparent in terms of the carbon credits that they have and the flow of kind of finance, and do it in the right way. And just finally on that, we've done some important piece of work with Kew Gardens, one of our partners, on how businesses can invest in nature. We've come up with 10 principles. It's on the Kew kind of website. Have a look. It talks about how to invest in kind of projects that look at both people and nature, so that you work with stakeholders, indigenous people, how you invest in the long term. Any kind of project that you're looking at around nature and biodiversity has to be managed, and it has to be managed for the long term. So I'm a good advocate of doing the right thing and investing, but it has to be in addition to anything that you do in absolute terms.
Great, thank you. So there's a lot of practical example that you're giving about what businesses can do today. I've picked up a number of themes as we've gone through this. One is that we have to redo our supply chains. Our supply chains that exist now are not fit for purpose. Another is that we have to break down silos. Another is that we need to look at opportunities, not just the problems. But we're getting some questions in. One person has asked, how do we actually define nature positive? So, and then measure it. Does anybody want to try and answer that one?
Well, I can start. There's a lot of work and thinking going around that, but maybe one thing that's, when we start talking about, and a few of the questions kind of allude to that, we say climate is simple, nature is complicated. I don't think climate is simple. If it was simple, we would have solved it and it would be done and dusted and we would move to it is not. And it took a lot of time in identifying some metrics, and it's the same with nature. It's not simple, and still we need to find a way. And it's breaking down. It's maybe not finding one metrics, is having 4 or 5 that would identify different things. So the science-based target network is working on ocean, on freshwater, on land. So we need to break down and stop looking for this one single bullet thing that would help addressing everything. So it's not really answering the question, but it's maybe just, thinking that all of this, it doesn't have to be simple. We just need to find ways, but maybe you,
Yeah, no, I mean, I can, so there are different biodiversity metrics basically out there. As UNEP, we've helped develop different financial facilities with impact investors and commercial banks. One of them that I've been involved in is called the Agri-Free Fund, which is essentially providing guarantees to development finance institutions and commercial banks to lengthen the repayment to farmers or businesses in developing countries from, say, 2 to 3 years to 10 or 12 years. And what we're basically asking is indicators around how many jobs are being created, disaggregated by gender, how many CO2 emissions are avoided, but also how much tropical forest is protected or restored. There are other indicators as well, and that is to say, those who have an interest in making sure that it's sustainable from an equity perspective, from a climate perspective, and a nature perspective, that the indicators are there. But besides identifying it, it's really saying, like, how do you embed that with your clients? And those who are interested in some of those facilities that we've developed, please do reach out after the session as well.
Okay. Edward?
Yeah, sure. Perhaps I think we've actually just picked up on 2 questions at the same time, which is great, which is on the nature positive and also the metrics without a carbon equivalent. So yeah, certainly there are lots of, I guess, different interpretations of nature positive out there at the moment, different applications. Originally, I think it came out of a sort of a civil society group, and it was really about having a very clear target by 2030 to have, halted and reversed biodiversity loss. So essentially, by 2030, biodiversity is in a better state than it is today. So I think it's more sort of a word of warning. Also, listening to some of the recent discussions that have been taking place around net zero and greenwashing and that sort of stuff. And that's really the idea that if we are going to be saying we're nature positive or wanted to be on a nature positive path, we need to define that quite clearly. We need to have clear targets, milestones, and monitor progress towards that. I think that's the only way we can actually be sure together to work towards that 2030, 2050 final objective.
What I haven't heard any of you talk about is TNFD, which is a framework that's coming in to help give that guidance to business around what is involved in nature positive. Fiona, you're being asked, will Sky do some media programming to try and push the issue of biodiversity?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have actually, and I don't mind people if they haven't watched it all, but we have actually been doing programming for a while around environmental issues. So we ran a big campaign, Sky Rainforest Rescue, which was actually in the Amazon project. It was a project that we did in the Amazon rainforest to protect 1 billion trees there with WWF, with Acre state government, and with the Brazil government at the time, raising awareness of the issues of biodiversity and kind of rainforest protection. But we have made a pact more broadly with the whole of our sector, which we launched at COP26, which was around a content pledge, so that all the broadcasters would look at how we integrate climate and nature kind of programming into all of our kind of channels. We've been running this a lot with our genres around sports, news, and also kids channels. But the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 are also getting behind this. So yes, I think this is about the advocacy, and our particular opportunity as a broadcaster is really to raise the awareness to such an extent that a systems change and a kind of tipping point will happen so that people and everybody will know what they can do around this.
Okay, great. There have been a couple of questions asking about, this is a very northern discussion, and where is the emerging market voice in all of this? I mean, this is close to my heart, so I'll let one of you take on. Who would like to? Eva?
I mean, I think there was a new term, MENOS, like men-only panels, and that is now like a faux pas, as the French would say. I think the second element that we need is basically a geographically diverse panel. So I think that is something that conference organizers can look at. I think neither of the individual panelists could be held accountable for that, but I think it is important when we talk about this topic that ideally you have a geographic balance in addition to gender balance.
Yeah. Because much of the hit of biodiversity is actually further down the supply chain.
Yeah, and there's the question also, how can communities in emerging markets being involved? They are involved. Actually, when you look at the key biodiversity areas, they are in majority being managed by local communities, so they are doing the work. The question is not how to involve them, but how to support them, and how to make sure that they get what they, like, Eddie was talking about the payment for ecosystem services. How do we put that more? And there's another question earlier on how to make sure we also engage emerging markets. Again, they are really much engaged, and they understand more than probably our countries here the issue, because they are like living the impacts. The country, I mean, unless climate, the impacts of biodiversity is very local. So what they were saying very loud and clear at the COP is that they need the financial resources and the technical resources to be able to implement the solutions, because they do want to do that. So it's also the role as businesses. You all probably have very large value chains and engagement in these countries to really support and engage the value chain and the companies that constitute those value chains in this emerging market with the tools, with the capacities, with capacity building and support to make sure that they can evolve, because the communities, the consumers, the governments in those countries are very much engaged and wants to act, but they just need more support.
Edward,
Yeah, perhaps just add, I think you're right to pose that question. Certainly, if you look at the distribution of biodiversity globally as well, I think more just to emphasise the importance of looking at this issue, because we're seeing biodiversity investment as an opportunity, and I think that's a good narrative to have as well. So, as you were saying, Fiona, fix your own house, reduce your own impacts, but also we've got a big opportunity to scale up restoration. So we need to get private investment into restoration of degraded ecosystems. Now, there is going to be considerable spatial coincidence between these areas and some of the local communities that you're talking about. So we need to make sure that northern investments, face it, for a profit, are not disenfranchising these local communities, and they're part of the process from day one. So I think that's something that we're going to have to think a lot about when talking about biodiversity credits and the likes going forward.
Fiona, do you have any thoughts?
I would say that you have to, in terms of biodiversity and nature and the importance of investing in it and the importance of looking around the impact in your supply chain, it is a significant risk to business if they don't look at it and work with their suppliers to how they can kind of manage it. I mean, the World Economic Forum came out that, the biggest risks to business and the top 5 were all of the environment, the environment. And if we look at our kind of own supply chain in terms of not just the resources that we use to produce electronic kind of products and the impact on the environment and the availability of those materials or minerals in the long term, or even the cost of those minerals to us, that's a significant impact to us as a business. So we have to look at how we're going to reduce that impact by a kind of a circular economy kind of approach and a kind of a reuse model of our kind of products and services. But also just the majority of businesses, their supply chains are outside the UK. And they are, at risk in terms of the impact that we're seeing from climate change, whether that's flooding, that's wildfires. So, I would just add to everybody that's looked at this, you need to have a really proper assessment on the risks and opportunities, and particularly in your supply chain, and work with your suppliers and work with lots of different kind of groups and stakeholders on this.
Do you think extended producer responsibility will open the door to legal action to try and force this issue a little bit faster than it's running?
Possibly.
It's an interesting,
Yeah.
If we're looking now at supply chains through, how far does the producer have responsibility in all of your businesses?
Maybe just briefly, as I was taking the train 2 days ago from Geneva to London, I was surprised when I read that there's currently 1,800 to 2,000 court cases when governments, but also businesses, are being brought to court for inaction on climate change. And as to your point, Robin, I wouldn't be surprised that once biodiversity regulation is in place, the same could be started as well. Apparently, there's also advancement of having individual business leaders, and you can ask whether that's desirable or not, being personally held accountable for failing to meet climate targets. So it's, I think the pressure is going to be ramped up. In my view, the big question is how do we build the businesses of the future that generate economic value added and jobs within the context of planetary boundaries. I think that's...
And with equity.
And with equity.
Yeah. I'm afraid we're out of time, and thank you all very much. Thank you to the panel. And